Hi everyone, and welcome to today's chat, Activities for Developing Your Child's Executive Function Skills. I'm Laura, and I'm here today with Dr. Stephanie Carlson. Hi Stephanie, welcome, and could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, thank you, welcome. So I'm Stephanie Carlson. I'm a distinguished McKnight University professor at the University of Minnesota in the Institute of Child Development. And I'm also a co-founder and currently CEO of Reflection Sciences, which is a company developed out of the University of Minnesota that provides tools and supports for executive function development.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Before we dive in, a quick note for our viewers. You can enter your questions at any time during this chat in the chat box at your right, and we will do our best to get to all of your questions. So thank you so much for joining us today. So before we jump into questions, Stephanie, maybe you can just explain what is executive function and what are the three areas of executive function?
Sure. So executive function is kind of the brain basis of self-control, how we use our brains and minds in order to control our thoughts, actions, and feelings. And there are typically three aspects of executive function that people talk about and that we would be able to then help define executive function and also come up with specific activities to help develop these skills. So one aspect is working memory. So that has to do with holding information in mind and working with it. So when you're doing some kind of short-term memory rehearsal, or if you're trying to perform an arithmetic problem in your head, you're using your working memory skills. Or if you're trying to remember the beginning of a sentence as you get to the end of a sentence or a paragraph of text, you're using your working memory skills, kind of updating that information as you read the text. And then the second aspect is inhibitory control. So by that we mean being able to inhibit or stop or suppress a habitual action or kind of an automatic response, and instead to maybe do a different response as the situation calls for it. So if you think about like delayed gratification, where you're kind of delaying or postponing a reward, a tempting treat, the classic kind of marshmallow test is measuring kids' inhibitory control skills. And then the third aspect is cognitive flexibility. And that means being able to switch flexibly between different perspectives or ways of thinking about a problem or a situation, being able to get unstuck from a habitual or automatic response and instead respond in a different way. And so this comes into play when we're asking kids to switch gears from one activity to another activity, when we're trying to help them be less frustrated with a problem that they're just not able to kind of break through, to maybe think about it from a different angle. So these three skills, inhibitory control, working memory, cognitive flexibility, really all work together in executive function development and expression of executive function skills. They really rarely kind of operate in isolation from one another, but it is a handy way of kind of describing the major skills that go into this set of skills called executive function.
Great, thank you. And I believe that we are going to post a link to an infographic that we have on our website that outlines exactly what you just said, because I know that you helped us create that infographic, so thank you. And so to help viewers keep track, they can take a look at that graphic. But let's go back to working memory, and can you give a few more examples of ways that kids might rely on or use working memory in school and outside of school?
Sure. So I mentioned arithmetic and any kind of numeracy or mathematics kind of problem where you might be doing some of it in your head, would be using your working memory skills, being able to hold on to information temporarily while you search for additional information, or you think about the classic game of concentration, where you have to remember where you last saw one of the target cards and hold on to the information while you search for a match. Or with reading, I mentioned the example of holding on to the information at the beginning of the text to the end of the text or the story, so that you have strong reading comprehension. Let's see, just kind of any situation, any learning or instructional situation where you're asking kids to hold on to information maybe from the beginning of a lesson toward the end to the end of the lesson. To remember what they first thought. If they're continually, running up against a problem and unable to solve it, remembering all the solutions that they've already tried so that they don't keep trying the same incorrect solution. Those are a few examples.
And you mentioned some games. Can you talk more about strategies and games to help kids develop their working memory?
Yeah, so concentration is a good one, or Guess Who is kind of a commercial version of that. Computerized games can be beneficial as well for having to hold on to information while you attend to other information. There are physical activities too, or kind of physical games that you can do. We work mostly with the preschool age group, and there are a number of games there where you're asking kids to hold on to information temporarily. So, for example, the song Bingo, where you kind of go through the letters B-I-N-G-O, but you have to remember kind of where you are in the sequence to know which letter you're going to sing next. That's another kind of activity that would be taxing children's working memory skills and therefore exercising them and helping to develop and improve them.
And can older kids improve their working memory as well?
Absolutely. So practicing with longer strings of text or longer strings of numbers, gradually increasing that, increasing the delay between learning or taking in some kind of instructional material before they kind of spit it out or have to express that. I mentioned some of the computerized games, but you want to work on these skills in a variety of settings. So a variety of activities or games. So computerized games, could be just one aspect of helping to develop these skills or kind of one activity. But we have seen that if you kind of just drill and drill and drill on some of the computerized training programs for, say, working memory skills, that they have poor transfer to kind of real-world skills where you're needing to use your working memory, such as, in the classroom or doing homework and things like that. And so our research suggests that that practicing these skills in a variety of settings, not just video games, for example, that are designed for building working memory skills, but also physical activity games like Simon Says or varieties of games like that where you have to kind of remember what the rule is, and the rule might keep changing, and so you have to adapt to that as you go. We see that's more effective in terms of transfer to real-world activities where you need these skills.
And those I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's it.
Okay. And those video games that you were referencing, those are sometimes referred to as train the brain games. Is that right?
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So another area of executive function is inhibitory control. Is this, we get this question a lot from our community. Is it the same thing as self-control? And if not, how are they different?
Yeah, I think that you can use those terms interchangeably. Sometimes we use the term impulse control. It's a little bit more specific. Self-control can also just be a catch-all kind of phrase for executive function in general. So I think impulse control is maybe a little bit more specific, where we're asking kids to override or control or suppress their impulses in the moment in order to keep their kind of longer-term goal in mind. So, again, I mentioned the marshmallow test is a classic example of keeping that longer term goal in mind of getting the larger reward. And in the meantime, controlling your impulse to say, eat the marshmallow, or, we see this with kids and in a school context as well, needing to avoid the distraction of what's happening maybe around in the classroom. Maybe there's another child that's kind of having some acting out, and in order for you to focus on your work that's in front of you, you need to be able to kind of shut that out and not get lured by that or kind of drawn into that. Waiting for recess is another example of, attending in a focused and intentional way to what you're supposed to be doing, whatever your goal is in the classroom at the moment, and controlling that impulse to kind of want to get out there for recess before it's time to do so. Those are tricky and difficult skills for especially young children to be able to wait for that kind of gratification.
And Stephanie, we actually had a question come in about what is the marshmallow test. So there may be a few viewers who aren't familiar with it. Could you fill us in?
Sure. So this was really a task or a behavioral measure that was developed by Walter Mischel in the 1960s. He's a professor at Columbia University, and he at the time was at Stanford University, where they had a preschool on campus, and at this preschool, they tested 4-year-old children in their ability to delay gratification. And so they would present them with a tempting treat, such as marshmallows, and ask kids if they, make sure that they like marshmallows, or they could have other treats like Oreos and so forth. It wasn't always just marshmallows. But the task was to present them with a plate with 2 marshmallows on it, alongside a plate with 1 marshmallow. And the experimenter said, if you wait until I come back to the room by myself, then you can have the 2 marshmallows. But if you don't want to wait, that's okay. But then you only get 1 marshmallow. And so then you would confirm that kids want to wait, they want the 2 marshmallows. You leave the room, but then of course we'd be videotaping them to see if they, ate the marshmallow. Or sometimes there would be just 1 marshmallow present, and then the experimenter would be promising to come back with 2 if they didn't eat it. And what they found was that there was variability in 4-year-olds' decisions and ability to delay gratification in that situation. Some of them would eat the marshmallow immediately after the experimenter left the room, and others were able to wait up to 20 minutes for the experimenter to come back with 2 marshmallows. And it turned out that those individual differences have predicted long-term meaningful consequences for those individuals, including things having to do with self-control later in life.
And I don't want to go too far down this road, but I would love, if we had more time, I would have us talk about the Batman effect, which is part of your really cutting-edge research, which is, I think, based on the marshmallow test or riffing on it. But we'll post a link to that blog post that you wrote in our in the chat box. So thank you. I would love, there are some user questions that came in, but first, can you just give us a quick idea of some activities to help kids build inhibitory control?
Yeah, so you mentioned the Batman effect, and so that is related to one activity that, or set of activities that we recommend, particularly for younger children, which is pretend play. So with pretend play, kids are getting a lot of experience with doing things differently. So the thing about inhibitory control and executive function in general is encouraging kids to go off autopilot. Because when you're on autopilot, you're doing things in a habitual fashion, you're just kind of doing things that you've already learned and maybe mastered over and over again. you're not using your executive function skills in that case. Executive function, by definition, is effortful and kind of hard and challenging. And when you're being asked to do something that's different from how you normally do it, and I said getting off of autopilot. And pretend play is one context in which young children are already motivated to do that a lot, to pretend that the world is completely different, that imagine a world in which people walk on their hands, and imagine a world in which people, when the sun comes up at night and the moon comes up in the morning, or just kind of topsy-turvy worlds that kids are really good at imagining. It's utilizing those executive function skills, including inhibitory control.
It sounds like that would help build flexible thinking as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
I want to get to some of the questions that people are asking here. They're less about activities and more about executive function in general, but that's great. We had a question come in about the connection between executive function and ADHD. The question is, can executive function deficiencies exist independent of an ADHD diagnosis, or are they always intertwined? Tricky.
Great question. So ADHD represents kind of one end of a continuum of executive function skills. So you can think about it like a normal curve, where you have some extreme, a small number of extreme cases at the low end and a small number of extreme cases at the high end. But most individuals are falling kind of in the middle. And so think of it as a spectrum, and it's really, really normal for young kids to have a hard time with executive function. It takes a long time to develop. It's not fully developed until one's mid-20s. And so it's, one thing that we're learning with our measurement, the Minnesota Executive Function Scale, and other kind of lifespan approaches to looking at executive function is just kind of how common it is to have difficulty with these skills at a young age, and also getting a better sense of what the benchmarks are for what is normally developing executive function at each age. And I think with much better norms like that, we will see a decline in the incidence of diagnosed ADHD, for the most part, where our expectations in some cases for kids' self-control and executive function have exceeded what we should be expecting of them at a given age. That said, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, is a real impairment that affects a number of children and their families and teachers in a very grave way. And that's that kind of extreme end of the continuum where additional supports are needed. Medication can be helpful as well. But I guess I would just emphasize that it's one extreme end of this whole continuum of executive function skills.
And we have a few questions that have come in about helping teens, exercises and strategies for teens. I know on our site we've posted a slideshow of apps to help older kids build self-control or build inhibitory control. What other kinds of strategies would you recommend on that front?
Yeah, so one thing that we've been investigating in our lab is mindfulness activities, so things that help, and this is appropriate for teens and older children, to help focus and draw their attention to the self and to their own temptations, to their own impulses, to their own limitations when it comes to things like maybe working memory or cognitive flexibility, and really tuning in more to the self so that they can collect greater control over the self and be more reflective about their thoughts, actions, and feelings kind of before acting. So things that promote reflection for teens can be, mindfulness would help. Also encouraging reflective writing and having them, so reading also, as particularly literature that where there's a lot of mind reading going on, and some of the classic literature that is already assigned, fortunately, to a lot of adolescents to read in school. But those kinds of activities that are helping teens to become more reflective are a real key to developing and improving their executive function skills.
And you briefly mentioned medication. We had a few questions that came in around that as well for teens. ADHD medication as for helping with executive function. What are your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, so I guess it can be extremely helpful in many cases to helping with that core attention deficit that is contributing to difficulties for kids on that extreme end of executive function impairment. And in combination, I would say, with behavioral strategies is probably more useful than medication alone. It's not going to be indicated in every case. And as I mentioned earlier, I think what we're going to see as measurement and our understanding of normative benchmarks improves, that we will see a lower kind of overdiagnosis, if you will, of a developmental disorder like ADHD versus just this is a kid who's still developing their executive function skills. I think we're going to get some better definition around that, and that might affect the prescribing of medications as well.
And we'll post a link to a piece about things to consider when you're considering ADHD medication for your child. But what you were just saying at the end there is also is a good segue into another question that just came in about how can you differentiate between a true executive function deficiency and like just normal delays or normal executive function problems that all kids experience.
Yeah, I think so. We can look at once you have a good understanding of what that normal curve is and looks like at each age, then you can more easily define what might be considered atypical, aberrant, or extremely low, delayed, or impaired compared to one's peers at the same age. And so the sort of cutoff, there are clinical cutoffs that different experts will recommend. And, I'd just suggest that you speak with your clinician kind of about that. But it essentially the main thing that we still focus on or fall back on to define something that's really, really a problem versus just part of normative development of these skills, which take a long time, is where that individual student or child lies in relation to their peers on a set of executive function skills. So kind of, if it's obviously far behind their peers, then it's useful to know that so that you can try to address that as quickly as possible.
And we had a question come in from Dawn about, she says that her son isn't struggling so much with impulse control, but mostly issues with planning and cause and effect and getting off of autopilot. I know that planning and organization are all play into executive function. What kinds of strategies would you suggest for Dawn?
Great. So So again, things that promote reflection or metacognition. So metacognition is thinking about thinking. And when we're planning and developing strategies, one thing that happens as kids get on into middle and high school is longer term projects that and project-based learning that does require quite a bit of planning ability and this delayed gratification, kind of sequencing things out, breaking a really large task down into smaller tasks that are more easily achievable, and having some kind of accountability too, even if it's your own digital kind of calendar, that where you write out your plan and then you can program reminders for yourself. I broke down this activity into smaller ones, maybe with adult help, with parent help, but then leave it up to the student to kind of follow through on those steps. And absolutely, like digital reminders, like have you done, have you written the outline for that essay yet? You set that goal for yourself that was going to be due today. Have you done that? And as a parent myself, I'm a big fan of like taking some of the heat out of it for the parent, because those interactions can very quickly escalate into unpleasant ones if you're the nag or you're the one who's constantly reminding the student of what he or she needs to be doing on a given day. If you can kind of help them with the planning, but then let them go on their own, maybe with these supports like a planner, a paper or a digital planner. You can get the child's teacher involved as well to, again, have an ally in monitoring the student as they go through these activities and assignments without everything kind of falling on you as the parent.
And you just mentioned teachers. We had a question that came in earlier in the chat about how parents can discuss concerns with teachers that are concerns related to executive function. Do you have any suggestions there?
So, teachers are really good observers of student behavior and can be in a much better position than some parents to know what's normative and to see kind of that whole spectrum of development and skills within their own classroom in many cases. And so I think teachers can play a really important role in helping parents to identify this question of, is this normal? My child seems to have a really hard time paying attention, remembering things, planning things, following through on things. Is this normal? Teachers are in a really good position to be able to kind of suss out the very atypical absent-mindedness and impulsiveness of, say, a middle schooler from what might be, really a serious concern. And then there are a number of supports for teachers to help work with executive function difficulties in students in kind of a tiered fashion. There are things that you can do for all students to help boost these skills. And then there are things that you can do for selected students who are the ones who are struggling the most. And sometimes that's happening in more of a special education environment, but even in a typical classroom, there are ways to work with individual students to give them that additional support.
And we're running close to our time here, but I did want to get in one more question. We had a viewer who asked, do you have any ideas for strategies to serve gifted students with executive function needs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I want to emphasize that executive function skills, while positively correlated with IQ and intelligence, are by no means completely overlapping with IQ. And in fact, there are a lot of cases in which children can be quite bright, but struggling with executive function skills. And So it's, not at all just a case where children might be struggling academically in all areas, as well as executive function. You really can see some problems with follow-through, planfulness, attention, and thinking flexibly in kids who are considered gifted and talented as well. And here again, I would emphasize that a lot of the same principles would apply for designing and developing activities to help improve executive function skills. So even though the nature of the activity will look different, some of the principles would be the same. So encouraging reflection, keeping the challenge level up. So one thing that can happen, particularly with gifted and talented students, is boredom. And so once boredom sets in, that means that your child is kind of going on autopilot with that material. So really continually keeping the challenge level increasing so that the child is effortfully using these skills. And then again, also training executive function, if you want to call it that, in a variety of settings. So not just the computerized kind of brain games, but also physical activities as well. And lastly, the principle of keeping it fun. So executive function, skill building activities for all ages doesn't have to be drudgery. In fact, it's going to be far more effective, and deeper learning occurs when kids are enjoying themselves and having fun with the activities at the same time.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I know that we have a lot of content on our website about ways to help kids improve executive function, a lot of which we worked with you to create, so thank you. We're going to post a link right now about that is sort of like a repository of all our executive function strategies on the site, so that our viewers can hopefully find what they're looking for. And it includes a link to another blog post that you wrote, Stephanie, on Goldilocks parenting. So I'm sure people will be interested in finding out what that means. So with that, I think that we can finish up. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us today, Stephanie.
Thank you very much.
I hope everyone has a great week, and thanks for joining us today.